All right, strap in, everybody. Today, we are going deep, deep inside the mind of, well, one of history's most infamous figures, to say the least, Adolf Hitler. And look, before anyone thinks we're, trying to glorify a dictator, let me just stop you right there. That's not what this is about at all. What we're really interested in is kind of like, what were the psychological factors that might have, contributed to those horrific actions? You can think of it kind of like a historical case study, but, one with some pretty serious implications for, understanding just human behavior, even today, even now. So we've got a ton of material to go through. We've got historical analyses, psychological profiles, even some expert opinions all ready to help us kind of unpack this guy.
Yeah, it's so wild how Hitler's personality has just captivated, historians and psychologists for decades now, right? It's just this grim reminder that understanding the past is like the only way we can avoid repeating it.
Yeah.
And one of the earliest attempts to even analyze Hitler happened during World War II.
Whoa, really? Like as the war was still going on?
Yeah, absolutely. So the OSS, which was, the precursor to the CIA, they commissioned these analyses. So these two guys, Walter Seelanger and Henry Murray, they were both working completely independently of each other. And they both concluded that Hitler was probably neurotic, like maybe even bordering on psychosis. And they both picked up on this messiah complex thing, like Hitler really believed he was chosen to save Germany. And even more chilling, they both predicted that, if defeated, Hitler would probably commit suicide.
Wow. Talk about calling it, right? It's just wild that they were able to, draw those conclusions without even meeting him,
All right. And psychology was, a much younger field back then. So the fact that they reached such similar conclusions, even though they were working completely independently and, with pretty limited tools, it's kind of striking. And honestly, their work was really groundbreaking because it actually paved the way for, things like offender profiling and political psychology as we know them today.
So that's pretty huge. So let's fast forward, to some of the more recent analyses. One study that was published in 2007, it actually used standardized diagnostic criteria to assess Hitler. So that's like using the official psychology, rule book.
Exactly. They used what they called informant rating. So they had 5 historians, all experts on Hitler, and they had them rate him based on the criteria from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. That's the DSM.
Okay, so what was the verdict? Did Hitler, get a passing grade in Dictator 101?
Yeah.
My guess is probably not.
Yeah, not even close. So there was a really, really strong consensus that Hitler met the criteria for not 1, not 2, but 4 personality disorders: paranoid, antisocial, narcissistic, and sadistic. So let's start with paranoid personality disorder. Just imagine constantly feeling suspicious of literally everyone. Seeing threats, even where they don't exist. So people with this disorder often believe that, other people are trying to harm them, deceive them. It makes them very distrustful.
Okay. So that kind of explains, the whole enemies everywhere thing with Hitler.
Right.
Always feeling threatened and, seeing conspiracies. So it wasn't just like a leadership tactic. It was like part of who he was.
Exactly. Okay, so let's move on to antisocial personality disorder. This involves a disregard for the rights of others. So it can, manifest as deceitfulness, impulsivity, aggression, a lack of remorse. Basically just like a disregard for rules, and the well-being of others.
So Hitler's willingness to engage in that extreme violence, without a shred of remorse or his manipulative tactics, his, complete disregard for human life, those all fit this profile, right?
They absolutely do. Okay, now narcissistic personality disorder is all about grandiosity. So, just think, an inflated sense of self-importance, a constant need for admiration, and a lack of empathy for others.
So Hitler's belief in his own destiny, that he was somehow chosen to lead Germany to greatness, and his inability to, recognize or care about the suffering of others, that's classic narcissism.
You got it.
Oh.
And then finally, we have sadistic personality disorder, and this one's a little bit darker. It involves a fascination with inflicting pain or humiliation on others, deriving pleasure from their suffering.
Oh, man. And tragically, we see the most horrifying manifestation of this in, the policies of the Nazi regime, like the unimaginable suffering and death that happened under his command. It sends chills down my spine.
Yeah, it's really heavy stuff. But I think what's important to understand is that these disorders probably didn't exist in isolation. They probably interacted and amplified each other. It created this incredibly volatile and destructive personality.
Yeah, it's a recipe for disaster. And that's not even the end of it. This 2007 study, they also found indications of things like PTSD and like psychotic features.
Right. So the historians in the study, they rated Hitler particularly high on scales for PTSD, psychotic thinking, and paranoid schizophrenia.
Wait, PTSD? I thought that was something that, soldiers get after experiencing trauma in war.
It is, but in Hitler's case, the horrors that he experienced as a soldier in World War I, and potentially even childhood trauma, it could have contributed. PTSD can cause, flashbacks, nightmares, hypervigilance, emotional numbing. Imagine how that could have affected his mental state and his decision making.
That's pretty intense. Okay, so PTSD makes sense, but what about like psychotic thinking?
So that involves a detachment from reality. It can kind of manifest as disorganized thoughts, unusual beliefs, or just difficulty distinguishing between what's real and what's not. And then we have paranoid schizophrenia, which involves like delusions and hallucinations, often focused on, themes of persecution.
So basically they're saying there's a chance that Hitler wasn't always seeing things clearly, like literally.
It's important to remember that diagnosing someone posthumously, especially with like complex conditions like schizophrenia, it's really challenging. We can't interview him, we can't observe his behavior directly. But the fact that, psychotic features have been identified across multiple analyses, even the early ones by, Langer and Murray, that's significant. It suggests a very troubled mind.
This is already painting a pretty disturbing picture. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. We've still got a lot more to uncover about the, psychological factors that shape this dictator. We talked about those, 4 personality disorders, but remember there were other analyses too.
Right, like Eric Fromm, he was a psychoanalyst, and he had some intense things to say about Hitler.
Fromm was not one to, mince words. He called Hitler a non-sexual necrophilous character and a malignant aggressor. So basically, Fromm believed that Hitler was like deeply drawn to death and destruction. It wasn't just about power for him, it was about annihilation.
That is like really disturbing. And then there's Carl Jung, who actually met Hitler. Talk about an awkward encounter, right?
Jung's observation is chilling, really. He described Hitler as, like, inhuman and sexless, driven solely by the establishment of the Third Reich. And it just kind of reinforces this image of Hitler as, like, someone totally consumed by his ambition and, completely devoid of, like, typical human emotions and connections.
Okay, so we've got these formal diagnoses and these really intense psychoanalytic interpretations. But to really understand how those traits developed, we have to look at Hitler's early life, right?
Absolutely. His childhood was, well, anything but idyllic. Accounts consistently describe his father as, like, incredibly authoritarian, prone to violence, and demanding absolute obedience. You can just imagine, what kind of atmosphere that created at home.
Yeah, it sounds toxic. And Hitler himself actually admitted to fearing his father. There's even this, like, disturbing story about young Hitler refusing to cry after being severely beaten by him. It's like he learned to, like, suppress his emotions at a very young age.
Right. And that type of harsh authoritarian parenting, with its lack of warmth and emphasis on discipline, it can have a profound impact on a child's development. And, research has actually shown a really strong correlation between, that type of upbringing and aggressive or antisocial behavior later in life.
So those seeds were sown early on. But his relationship with his mother was quite different, right?
Yeah, it was. His mother was described as kind and submissive, which was, a very stark contrast to his father. But the family experienced the loss of several children in infancy. So just imagine the grief and sorrow that must have pervaded their home.
Right, that early exposure to death and loss, and then coupled with his father's harshness, it had to have some kind of impact, right? It's like a recipe for some serious psychological turmoil.
Absolutely. And some analyses have actually suggested that despite her kindness, there may have been a really strong and potentially even unhealthy attachment between Hitler and his mother, possibly fueled by, that shared grief.
Oh, wow. Okay, so it's not just one thing. It's this, like, complex interplay of different factors. You've got the brutal authoritarian father, the loving but, potentially overprotective mother, and then you've got that early exposure to loss and grief. It just all adds up.
It really does. And during his adolescence, Hitler was already displaying some troubling traits. He was described as impulsive, egocentric, cold, aggressive, and prone to, like, retreating into fantasy. So these tendencies were already there, simmering beneath the surface.
It's like we're seeing the foundation of the dictator that he would eventually become. And then you add in those, like, those core personality traits that are consistently attributed to him. impulsivity, egocentricity, coldness, aggression, paranoia, narcissism, sadism. It's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, and those traits likely kind of fed off each other too,
Hmm.
creating this feedback loop that just spiraled out of control. But remember, there's another layer to this, right? His public persona, that,
Yeah.
charismatic Führer image. So how did this, deeply troubled individual manage to create such a powerful and seductive public image?
That's what I find so fascinating. Like how much of it was genuine and how much was like a calculated performance? Was it all an act?
That's the million-dollar question. Remember what Henry Murray called counteractive narcissism?
Hmm.
So Hitler was driven to, overcompensate for his feelings of inferiority, to project this image of like absolute power and confidence to kind of mask those deep-seated insecurities.
It was all an act. He was just like a scared little boy behind that facade.
It's not quite that simple. There's a little more nuance than that. Just imagine, if you're constantly feeling inadequate and threatened and insecure, wouldn't you want to create a persona that projects strength and dominance? And that's exactly what Hitler did. He consciously cultivated his public image. He honed his skills as, an orator, and he surrounded himself with people who reinforced his beliefs.
So he was like both insecure and a master manipulator. That's a terrifying combination.
Oh, it absolutely is. And it's a reminder that we can't always take things at face value. People, especially, those in positions of power, they often present a carefully curated version of themselves to the world. So it's up to us to, to look beyond the surface, question what we see and hear, and be wary of those who seem, too good to be true.
Yeah, that's such a valuable lesson, especially today in our world, where information and misinformation spreads so quickly. It's easier than ever to be, swept up in a charismatic leader's message
Yeah.
without really realizing what's going on beneath the surface.
Exactly. And that kind of brings us to another crucial piece of this puzzle, which is propaganda. The Nazi propaganda machine was incredibly effective at shaping public perception, building this cult of personality around Hitler, portraying him as this like godlike savior. They used everything at their disposal, like posters, films, radio broadcasts, these huge rallies.
It's chilling to think, just how powerful propaganda can be, how it can like warp people's perceptions of reality.
It really can. It preys on, people's emotions, their fears, their desires. It basically bypasses rational thought. And Hitler himself was a master of it. His speeches were legendary. He would just captivate these audiences with, these dramatic gestures, powerful language, and this mesmerizing tone of voice.
It's like he, hypnotized an entire nation.
In a way, he did. He used scapegoating. Right. Blaming Germany's problems on, the Jews, communists, any other groups he could. He used repetition, hammering home the same messages until they were like ingrained in people's minds.
Hmm.
And he appealed to, their sense of patriotism, their sense of national pride, promising to restore Germany to its, former glory.
It was a potent mix. And, tragically, it worked. Millions of Germans were just completely seduced by Hitler's promises, blinded to his true nature and the horrors that would follow.
It's a reminder that even in the most civilized societies, the potential for manipulation and tyranny, it's always there. We need to be vigilant, aware of the tactics used to manipulate public opinion, and just be critical of the information that we consume.
It's like we need to develop a sort of psychological immune system or something to protect ourselves from these kind of influences.
Exactly. We need to be informed. We need to be critical thinkers. We need to be, active participants in our democracies.
What can we do? How do we like apply these lessons from, Hitler's rise to our own lives?
Well, I think awareness is key. We need to be aware of the dangers of, you know, unchecked power of charismatic leaders who, prey on people's vulnerabilities. And we need to be aware of our own biases too, our own prejudices. We all have them, but we have to be conscious of them,
Hmm.
challenge them and make sure they don't cloud our judgment.
So
It's about educating ourselves, understanding how propaganda works, recognizing the warning signs of tyranny, It's about reading history, engaging in, thoughtful discussions, and being informed citizens.
and most importantly, it's about having the courage to speak out against injustice,
Mhm.
and to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult, to not be a bystander when we see these patterns playing out in, in our own communities or on the world stage.
You got it. Silence is complicity if we see something wrong. We have a moral obligation to say something, to do something. It's about remembering the victims, honoring their memory by, fighting for a better world, a world where, these kinds of horrors never happen again.
That's a really powerful message to end on. Well, thank you all for joining us on this deep dive into the mind of a dictator. It's a journey I think we should never forget, and its lessons are as relevant today as ever.
Stay curious, everyone. Stay informed, and most importantly, stay engaged. The world needs your voice.
We'll see you next time